Welcome again. This is Papa John. Welcome back to another episode of Papa John's Scripture Notes. And in the last episode, we went through the 10 Commandments, the 10 declarations, the instructions from the Almighty, spoken from the mountaintop for all the people, all the children of Israel to hear firsthand. It didn't go through Moses, but then the people were like, hey, this is too much. Hey, we're going to step back. And Moses, you go talk to God, and whatever he says, we will do, which is unfortunate. I hope we don't make that mistake. I hope with the help of Papa John's Scripture Notes, the project that I've been working on, that we can find the courage and even the comfort in knowing that God is, he's not impossible to know. He's tangible in the sense that we can feel his presence. He's looking for relationship, and he's reachable. Behind the words on the pages of our Bible, behind the screens, the computer screen with the scriptures, there is the true and living God of Israel. And he's introduced himself to the children of Israel in a very dramatic way. He's freed them from slavery for over 200 years, 215 years or so. It's been 400 some years since he made a covenant with Abraham. These are dramatic and powerful stories. Now, in the LDS Church, we have our Come Follow Me curriculum every year, and this year we're focused on the Old Testament. That's what kind of inspired Papa John to start right here in the beginning with the Old Testament, because all of our other books of Scripture are dependent upon the Old Testament for many reasons, one of which is the creation story itself. Uh, that's not in the New Testament. It's referenced, but it's not recorded. Even in the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, Doctrine and Covenants, we're all dependent upon the Old Testament. In fact, Christianity as a whole focuses so much on the New Testament as if somehow the Old Testament has been done away with. And we know that's not true, especially in Judaism, because they're still focused solely on the Old Testament. So it's important, I believe, to get back to the Judeo roots of the Christian faith. And that's our goal. We're going to move on to Exodus chapter 21, even though the Come Follow Me curriculum for the LDS Church is skipping all the way to, I believe, chapter 24 of Exodus. I looked through the chapters 21, 22, and 23, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot skip these. And yes, these are considered the lesser commandments. You know, they were the ones that Moses now conveys to the children of Israel. He's kind of the mediator between them and the Lord. But you'll be shocked at how much these still affect our world today. Um, and in fact, there's a pearl in here that's so powerful. I hope you get as excited as I do as we get towards the end of chapter 23 and we see an interplay between the Father and the Son and how their names correspond with each other. This is a hint of what we'll see again in dramatic fashion towards his resurrection when he reappears, having overcome death, and what the communications he has with the women uh, that morning, the morning of the resurrection. So this is a teaser for the New Testament and the resurrection story. Now, Exodus chapter 21 is the Meshpatim in Hebrew, meaning judgments or ordinances, and is the 18th parashah weekly Torah portion and the annual reading for the Jewish cycle. Their cycle goes from Exodus 21 to 24:18, and it presents a detailed rational civil and criminal code. You'll be surprised how much this is still codified in our modern day laws, often called the Covenant Code, covering laws on slavery, property damage, personal injury, and ethical and social behavior following the 10 Commandments, which were in the last chapter. Slavery. Do you know Papa John years ago made the foolish comment that he was surprised that in the Bible it's completely silent on the slavery issue? And I thought that was odd, that obviously God would condemn slavery. Well, here it is. I just never recognized it before. We're going to find that here in chapter 21 as God addresses slavery directly. Jared Halverson is going to begin with verses 1 through 6. He says there's a law against perpetual servitude, and that's important for Israel since they were in perpetual servitude, slavery for 4 centuries plus back in Egypt. Now, so we've got, he continues, so we've got to make sure that that never happens again, ever. Well, nice thought, because we still deal with slavery issues even today. He concludes this footnote by saying, from verse 12 all the way through verse 36, we'll see a ton of civil and criminal laws being legislated here and legislated by God himself. He's a pretty good source. And the most famous is what we'll see in verses 23 through 25. So, verse 1, Michael Rood, our Bible scholar, says, he starts out with these instructions slash commandments, that's what we call them, with the details and explaining how indentured servitude works. But if we skip to chapter 23, verse 14, to read as what the Lord describes how we are to go to the feast of Yehovah 3 times a year, but we're going to hold off. I mean, Michael Rood's ready to skip this whole chapter or several chapters, but we're going to hold off. Verse 2, if thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. All right, let's figure out what's being taught here. Our LDS scholar again, Jared Halverson, says, so here's the rule, verse 2, if thou be an Hebrew servant, this could be indentured servitude. Slavery was allowed at that time period. It wasn't just race-based, as it was in our day. But if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and the 7th year he shall go free for nothing. Interesting how the 7th year, Papa John, are you picking up on the similarity of the weekly Sabbath here? Now, Jared Halverson continues, so 7th day of rest, 7th year of rest, okay, that makes sense. After 6 years, you go free. Thank you. I purchased all this service. Thank you for rendering it. And now you're free to leave unless you don't want to go. Perhaps you came with nothing and now you have so much. Perhaps you're married and have children and you don't want to leave. Perhaps you've come to love the master that you've been serving. Now, this would suggest a very good master, one that's been blessing you as much as you've been a blessing to him. Well, under those conditions, look at verse 5. But before we get there, Papa John wants to look at verse 4. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Well, that doesn't sound right. Well, thankfully, our Hebrew scholar, Nehemiah Gordon, will give us additional clarity. Well, you can't understand this particular passage unless there's actually 2 other passages in the Torah, one in Leviticus 25, verses 39 to 55, and the other in Deuteronomy 16, 12 to 18. And then the whole issue is revisited in Jeremiah 34, 8 to 22. Isn't that valuable, just to know where to look for understanding? I mean, I'm very blessed to I believe the Lord has led me to these scholars to help me find those that I trust and that seem to be consistent in their views and not hostile towards Christianity, and in fact very comfortable. Nehemiah Gordon's very comfortable in finding commonality between the Jewish Orthodox understanding of the Torah and with the Christian belief in Christ as the Messiah, though he still reserves the right to not decide at this point, and that's a whole nother story. But he's a very transparent, honest scholar, and he likes to find commonality between God the Father and the Christian faith, and kind of leave the Son, Christ or Yeshua, to a future debate, or he's actually waiting for certain prophecies to be fulfilled before deciding. And that's okay. He's honest and transparent about that. Now he says, so really, we have 3 passages in the Torah and this 4th one in Jeremiah. To get the full picture, we need to read all of them together. So I think it's important for these commandments to look at all the different passages that talk about them. It's very often presented from different perspectives, and different little pieces of information are given. We could spend an entire hour just talking about slaves. And Papa John was foolish enough to think there was silence on this subject, but you're going to see why right here. It's very clearly talks about how Nehemiah says you really can't mistreat your Hebrew slaves. And let me just use the word, if I'm allowed to use this, because servant in the scriptures is a euphemism. Really, the word used in Hebrew is eved, which is slave. Well, no wonder I could never find slavery, because I was always seeing the word servant in that as a not clearly. Clearly, there's a difference. Well, or is there? So he continues. So you can't mistreat your Hebrew slave. Essentially, the Hebrew slave takes on a role that we call in English, at least, the indentured servant. He works for 6 years, and in the seventh year, he goes free. It says he should be like a hired worker or a foreign resident with you, and he shall serve you. He shall work for you until the year of the Jubilee. This is significant because in this passage in Exodus, it talks about if he decides to stay with you, he'll stay with you. It says forever here in Exodus 21, verse 6. It says, and he will serve you forever. And then forever is defined in Leviticus chapter 25. Now, you'll find this interesting as up until the Jubilee year, which is a maximum of 49 years. Think about that. The Jubilee year, 49 years, and then the 50th was the Jubilee. So forever, if you understand why it says forever, Nehemiah is going to explain, you know that the average lifespan back then was probably like 40 or 50 years. Actually, the average lifespan was much less, but people did live into their 40s and 50s. So that is, for all intents and purposes, forever. So in any event, what it's establishing is normally he'll work 6 years, then he'll go out in the seventh. Then that in itself was revolutionary because normally in the ancient world and in some countries to this day, slavery is forever, really forever, for like generation after generation. This is a revolutionary system compared to what existed in the ancient world. And like I said, Nehemiah says it still exists in some countries today in the Islamic world where slavery is generational after generation. Um, a lot of people, he continues, will look down on this passage and say, well, the Bible has slavery. It's so backwards, it's so primitive. But it's interesting when we look at the passage in Genesis where the Egyptians found out that they were going to have to pay 20% annual income tax to Pharaoh. They said, we're slaves to Pharaoh. And yet they're the Egyptians. And Nehemiah says, and when I read that, I said, oh, if only I lived in the days of Pharaoh, when his slavery was only a 20% tax to the sovereign. Then he continues, here's another little point for the Americans to consider. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. And if you read that amendment to the United States, the U.S. Constitution, it doesn't completely abolish slavery. It only abolishes slavery except for as a punishment. And so by American law, all those men who are in prison are by law, by the Constitution, they are slaves. He says, if not, I'm not mistaken, the United States has, if not the highest, one of the highest populations of prison inmate slaves in the world. And that's not for just 6 years, and you go out free on the seventh. It's often for life. I want to say something extremely controversial, he adds, that may need to be edited out, which is, and here I actually looked it up on the internet and I found the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then he adds, I really wonder if there are more black men today enslaved in the United States under this rule of the Constitution than there were in 1864 when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And even if it's not more, I happen to know it's in the millions, which is a staggering number. There are millions who are, as a punishment, have been oppressed into slavery. And you might say, oh, well, they deserved it, but we all know, maybe some people will say they don't know, but if you look at the conviction rate of white people in the United States versus African American, you'll see that this is slavery through the back door. There, I said that. Nehemiah says, I've said it. You may need to edit that out. I know it's controversial, but I said it. And then two real quick points on that in the Torah. There's two ways to get sold into slavery. One is if you are a criminal who can't pay restitution, specifically from theft. And we're going to read that later in the chapter, in this Torah portion. And the second way to get sold into slavery, and this was probably the primary way, is you voluntarily sell yourself into slavery. And he'll explain more about that. Now, our Methodist minister, Keith Johnson, responds and he says, it's interesting. And he goes, as an African American person myself, when I read this, I kind of get a little uncomfortable. As Nehemiah said, we kind of tiptoe around the tulips and say servant, but it said slaves in the Hebrew. And what's so amazing to me as I'm reading this portion is I started to read it based on the fact that it is what we just read. And when I read this passage for the first time in my life, really putting this in context and not wanting to rush through it, because I'll be honest with you, thinking about my own ancestry, I do want to rush through it. The first thing God says, though, is they came out and they hear the voice of God, and this God now is going to tell you, here's how I deal with my people. God doesn't tiptoe around the tulips. He says, now, if this happens, here's how you have to treat them. It kind of changed my view now that I put it into context. What interesting insights we're gaining from our scholars from different backgrounds. Again, I hope this is helpful for my children and my children's children, future posterity, my extended family, and the friends that I've met throughout life on my faith journey. Back to Nehemiah Gordon, our Hebrew scholar. He goes, now there is no system in the Torah where people wait outside hiding in some African countries and kidnapping people and sell them into slavery. In the Torah, where people said, look, I'm not making it, times are tough, I'm going to sell myself for 6 years, I'm going to sign a contract of indentured servitude, which used to exist also in the American colonies under the title of rubric. But this idea of going and forcing people into slavery who did absolutely nothing wrong and are completely innocent, that is against the Torah. That is not permissible whatsoever. So the way the Africans were taken and kidnapped and brought to Europe and to America, that is completely against Torah. So we just need to, I think this is healthy for us to realize and understand the differences. Back to our Methodist minister Keith Johnson. He says, what I really appreciate about the passage is that Yehovah doesn't say, let's just act like slavery never happened. Let's just only deal with the nice things. Let's just deal with the easy things. No, the creator of the universe, our Heavenly Father, who's looking at human affairs and saying, within the context of human affairs, here's how you deal with one another. I think it's really important that we approach it that way. Let's go ahead and have the discussion about slavery. We got Jono, a guy in Australia. I think your whole island at one point, people were sent there as prisoners. Isn't that right? And Jono Vandor, our messianic believer from Australia, says, absolutely correct. It was a penal colony for many years where the British settlers first came here. That's right. Now, Keith Johnson says, my point is, it would be easy for us with a topic like this to not talk about any of it. Yet we find Jono's got a history in Australia regarding it. And Keith has, myself has generations forcibly brought over from Africa into the United States, and it wasn't that many years ago where he could have been born into a house where there was a slave master and he had no rights, no abilities, no discussion. People would use the Bible to say, see, look, God approves of this as far as me having you in slavery. And Nehemiah's background, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? If it's true that Nehemiah's got bloodline that goes all the way back, whenever it might have been, that would include bloodlines into groups of people who were slaves as well. So here we are, all together, the three of us, with this sort of hot topic. It's a difficult one for me, but I think the Torah brings that into a different context. It's important that we go ahead and have these conversations, and I couldn't agree more. Wonderfully, this is such an open dialogue that we're able to include in the Papa John notes. Now back to our Hebrew scholar. He says, I do think it's interesting that you're saying all three of us are descendants at one point of history, some of us more recently than others, but we're all descendants from people in slavery. So I just want to bring one more passage. Jeremiah 34, the entire chapter really focuses on the destruction of the temple. And then the reason that the temple would be destroyed. And the reason the temple would be destroyed is that the people of the kingdom of Judah under King Zedekiah, who was the last king, made a covenant, and they swore that they would free their slaves and end slavery once and for all. Then they reneged on that covenant. They went back on it and took slaves back into bondage. Jeremiah says because of that, the temple is to be destroyed, which is amazing because one of the two most significant pivotal events in history for me as a Jew is the destruction of the first temple, which is related to the first exile, and the destruction of the second temple, which led to the second exile. Both times they were scattered throughout the world, the diaspora. And the reason the prophet gives for the destruction of the first temple is the slavery of the Jews and slavery in his fellow Jew. They went to the house of the temple, the house of Jehovah, and they made a covenant there saying they would free their slaves once and for all. And they swore. We've been talking about swearing. So they swore in the name of Jehovah. They made an oath, making a covenant in the place of Jehovah's name. And they called upon his name when they made that oath. And they said they would free their slaves. And then they went and they took their slaves back. Because of that, the temple was destroyed. And we asked the question, well, how does this apply today? We just had this whole long discussion about slavery. Does this really apply today? Well, I think Jeremiah is giving us the application for today. That's the people of Israel made this covenant with Jehovah that they would henceforth free the slaves, and we really can't go back on that. That's something I believe is even binding today. So I'd say when the Messiah comes, Nehemiah adds, I don't believe we're going to have slavery. I think we're going to be calling freedom and proclaiming liberty, each man with his fellow, and we will all be servants of the living God and not enslaving each other. Yeah, I hope you can see why Papa John couldn't skip this chapter. Now, verse 5, with our LDS scholar, he says, and if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free. So then he's going to help us understand. If there's this desire to remain, then you can stay. But there's going to need to be a way to prove to other people that you're here by choice and not by compulsion. Otherwise, your master could get in trouble. I'm not keeping them here against their will. They just love it here. I can't let them go. They don't want to leave. Well, what are we going to do to make sure that people know that? Verse 6 gives us that answer. Verse 6, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. So this is going to be a public act. The world is going to know. And the verse continues, he shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost. Now here's where it gets weird. Jared Halverson says, and the verse finishes with this phrase, and his master shall bore his ear through an awl, and he shall serve him forever. All right, Jared, help us understand. He goes, do you understand now? Do you understand why I tell returned missionaries to get their ears pierced? Remember the last episode? That's what he said. That was the teaser for you to want to watch this episode. He goes, because that's what the servant's supposed to do. So if you want to stay to serve, okay, if you want to be attached to the household, we can symbolize that. Bring the judges over, stand here next to the door, and the door frame that holds the blood of the lamb on the Passover. And let's shed a little of your own blood to mingle with that. Let's make you a permanent fixture here in your household. And I will nail you up to my wall with an awl through your earlobe. Don't worry, you won't stay long. I'll pull it out and we'll clean the wound. And now you'll have a pierced ear for the rest of your life, so that people will see that you won't, or that you want to keep serving. Now I hope you understand why I should suggest this for the returning missionaries. I'll often say to them, elder, sister, you served your time, you paid your dues. There's no such thing as perpetual servitude in the kingdom of God. Our Father, the King, doesn't believe in slavery. But if through this service you have come to truly love your master and recognize that every gift that you have in life has come from him, then wouldn't you want to just stay and serve forever? As I've said to my return missionaries, getting my ear pierced post-mission was the best thing I ever did. No, you won't see any holes in my earlobes. Not the literal kind. But spiritually speaking, I have done all I can to attach myself to the house of God, to continue rendering service that I hope is acceptable to Him. I really do love my master. So, my friends, Jared says, please don't get your ears pierced literally. Just stay and keep serving. I get a kick out of that. Now, Jono just says, Nehemiah, let me just clarify. Is he just piercing his ear or is he nailing the poor guy to the door? Oh, thankfully, we have a Hebrew scholar to ask these questions too. He says, no, the word is to drill. He's drilling in his ear. He's, piercing his ear, essentially drilling it. What I think is really interesting here is you read, he shall bring him to the judges. The word in Hebrew that they translated here as judges, and I think that's a correct translation in the context, but the word literally in Hebrew is ha Elohim, the gods. And that's a significant point that the word Elohim, which we translate correctly as God, sometimes, but sometimes it means judges. And there are verses where Elohim is plural. It is referring to judges because every time it talks about the God of Israel, Elohim is always singular. When the Philistines speak about the God of Israel, like in the book of Samuel, all of a sudden they start speaking about they. But whenever Israelites speak about the God of Israel, it's always he. So again, that just gives us unexpected information that is useful in Christianity. Again, I think it's important with our Christian worldview to not forget the Judeo roots of Christianity. And that's what we're trying to do here. Now, verse 7. In verse 7, we read, and if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. So, not sure what that means. And I'm going quickly through this. Nehemiah says, so a maidservant is not a slave. The word is amah. Amah is actually a female slave. They'll sometimes translate that as a servant, but in this context, it's sort of a wife who doesn't have the full rights of a wife. And more specifically, if you look at the word amah, it's described throughout the Torah, throughout Scripture, you'll find out that her children don't inherit along with the children of the other wives. So he also continues, if he takes another for him, three things he will not diminish. He shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marital rights. And this is interesting. In the Western pagan culture, it's the woman's duty to a man, those particular rights, whereas in the Torah, it's his obligation, it's his duty towards her. And by the way, bear in mind, this is speaking about Amah, who is essentially like you would say a concubine. She's sort of a wife without the full rights. And the way that the Jewish sages have looked at this, and I think correctly so, is to say, well, if this is the right of a concubine who has less rights than a full wife, then a full wife definitely has these rights as well, along with the rights of inheritance for her children. Again, a little different from our day, but this is what's being discussed here. And a lot of this stuff has ended up codified in even our law books. Black's Law Dictionary inherits much from the Bible, even the common law that we get from England. Now, Jared Halverson is going to focus on verse 10 for us. He says, if you take another wife, so this is where we get into plural marriage, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage, so there's intimacy, shall he not diminish. So in plural marriage, every wife is meant to be treated equally and respectfully, not as a second-class citizen. It's interesting that within this culture that allows it in places where God had commanded it. He's still concerned, though, about for every member of the family. That's important to keep in mind when it comes to God. Verse 11, if he do not these three unto her. What are those three? The three of protecting and providing for her and treating her like immediate family, treating all of them equally. If you don't do these three, then she shall go free without money, which suggests, Halverson says, that they are not required to stay in unacceptable, unhealthy situations. We're going fast, but I think that's okay considering the context. Now, for Jared Halverson says, for verse 12 through 36, we'll see a ton of civil and criminal law being legislated here and legislated by God himself. The most famous is what we see in verses 23 to 25. When we think of the law of Moses, often we summarize it as a life for life, or an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, admittedly, that sounds barbaric by modern standards. An eye for an eye. Gandhi said, I love this quote, that would just make the whole world blind. But that's just from our perspective, Halverson says. From an Egyptian perspective, this is a huge leap in the right direction. We're trying to unlearn the Egyptian in them and relearn the Israelite heritage. Okay, that helps me a little bit with these verses. And then Halverson adds, and then later with Christ, what do you say? He says, we turn the other cheek and love our enemies. Like I said, Halverson's speaking here, it's going to take a while to overcome the altitude sickness and rise to that level of living. But even thinking about these terrestrial level, the justice of an eye for an eye, what good does that do? That's what I think Gandhi is pushing back against. That serves no purpose. Now we're all just going to end up blind. So, verse 13, and if a man lie not in wait, but Elohim deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. Nehemiah says, yeah, so you got, let's say, let's it happen, delivered into his hand. What it literally says is he caused his hand. So it literally says, and he that did not hunt, and God caused his hand. So what? That's confusing. So he says, meaning God did something to cause his hand to kill the other person accidentally, unintentionally, without malice, without premeditation. So that person isn't going to be executed, but he goes to the city of refuge. So that person is the tool of Elohim. It was Jimmy's time, according to God. And what's interesting is this is talking about sanctuary cities. There were places he could flee to where he could not be touched by the law until there could be a trial held. So sanctuary cities that we have today, as much as I dislike them and how they allow for crime to kind of run unchecked and encourage crime, I'm realizing this is an ancient concept. Well, but maybe not equally applied. But just interesting to realize they had set up for a place where someone could go to a different jurisdiction away from where the accident happened and hopefully receive a more fair trial. That's amazing. Verse 14, Jared Halverson says, pushes back against that. So, yes, there is a sanctuary for those that weren't malicious in their intent, but ended up doing something wrong. But you can't claim sanctuary when you don't deserve it. So, don't. We're not trying to abuse justice but neither are we trying to abuse mercy. Interesting to watch these laws trying to help Israel settle into this Goldilocks zone of the proving of the contraries. Now back to our Hebrew scholar. He says, I think that's a really significant commandment. We were just talking about slavery and how what they used to do in Africa is they would go and kidnap people. Well, in the Torah, kidnapping someone is punishable by death. This isn't some minor crime. This is a capital offense. That's how serious that crime is considered. Anything where you're holding someone against their will, and literally the word here is he who steals a person and sells him or is found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Interesting, isn't it? Verses 18 to 19, Halverson says, we see workers' compensation. If you injure someone, if that happens, he shall pay for the loss of his time. And later in verses 26 to 27, if the servant loses an eye or a tooth, then they're free to go. That's their compensation. That's even better than an eye for an eye. Continuing in verse 22, Halverson says, here's protection for the pregnant woman. God seems to be thinking of everything. If men strife and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit that's hers, there's a miscarriage, and yet no mischief follow. So the woman herself survives. The verse continues, he shall be surely punished according to as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judge is determined. So it was a wrongful miscarriage. See, the husband brings in the personal side and the judges bring in the impersonal. So both of these are necessary for a proper balance of justice and mercy. With the husband there, you better believe there's going to be justice, but with the judges, there's going to be a greater opportunity for mercy to intervene, taking in all the details into consideration. So it's not such a barbaric law that we often chalk up to the law of Moses. I think that's what I'm gaining. I'm realizing that we're so quick to say the law of Moses was done away with. Well, maybe certain elements after Christ came and fulfilled that law. Maybe we shouldn't just throw it all out. And I'm beginning to realize how true that is. Now, Nehemiah adds, this is talking about two people fighting, and one of them accidentally hits a pregnant woman. And the word here is asan. It usually translates as harm, or it could even be translated as tragedy. The way I'm reading this, he says, it's talking about the baby dying or coming out malformed in some way because of this fight that these two guys are having. The principle here is that there's this gross negligence in the presence of a pregnant woman, and there's actually a higher standard for harming a pregnant woman than for harming a regular person. There's actually a higher standard of responsibility for an unborn child than there is even for a born human. And that's because the unborn child has nobody to defend it. You need to be more careful in that context. And I think in our death culture today, it's refreshing to see life held so highly and the protection of the unborn. I think we could learn a lot from this chapter in our worldview of today. I'm often shocked at the death culture and the attitude that's so callous towards life. Um, Now, Jono Vandor adds in verse 26 and 27, it says, if you destroy their eye, you let them go free. If you knocked out a tooth, you let them go free. This seems to be a higher level of care that's difficult to reconcile otherwise. Okay. Jared Halverson, back to our LDS scholar, verse 28. Here's involuntary manslaughter. If an ox gore a man or a woman, that they die. So there's manslaughter, but it was involuntary. It was an accident. The ox did it. Then what's the result? You kill the ox, but not the owner. So that's logical. Now the next verse though, but if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, in other words, there's a history here of a bad behavior. So now it's willful neglect if the ox kills somebody because the owner didn't take care of the misbehaving ox previously. So now it becomes a capital crime if the ox killed someone. You had an opportunity to save the other person. So now if it's life for life and a capital punishment. Okay, I appreciate those additional insights. That helps a lot. So th- these verses that we're skipping through pretty quickly here go back to the involuntary manslaughter. Basically, the liability laws for willful neglect comes up in verses 33 and 34. This was a willful neglect on your part, and since nobody else's animal died, here's some enforced empathy. You just bought yourself a dead animal. You have to make it right since the animal died. You break it, you buy it. I guess that's where this comes from. Do you see how this continues in our world today in our laws? And I appreciate that. In fact, if you Google a picture of the Supreme Court building in the United States Capitol, you'll see images of Moses and the Ten Commandments. You'll see images of uh, Old Testament on up above, carved in marble stone. The founding fathers were definitely trying to preserve the source of common law that we use, that came from England and that we use in America. However, did you know the state of Louisiana is still under French law? Out of 50 states, Louisiana, because it was controlled by the French, uh, they have their laws are based differently than on common law. Just an odd fact from Papa John there. So Jared Howerson adds, so it was an accident, no fault on either part, but something happened. One party shouldn't have to bear the loss alone. Both parties should share the loss. So we're talking small claims court, perhaps. 36, the principle here, Nehemiah, our Hebrew scholar says, is very clear that you are responsible for your property. thinking about what the application of that would be today, if you live in a city and you have a swimming pool and you know there's children running around that swimming pool, it talks about here about a pit. Well, if anybody falls in and is killed from that swimming pool, you're responsible for that. You are responsible for being proactive and preventing people from getting harmed from your property in a way that you can reasonably predict that they might possibly get harmed. Wow, that was a lot. I hope you enjoyed that. I didn't want to spend too much time on this chapter because I'm so excited to get to chapter 23. But the next episode, we're going to focus on chapter 22. Thank you for your time, as always. Again, ponder these things, think about them, find time to study your scriptures on your own. Don't let Papa John replace your own study time. Be mindful, as I always say, about your surroundings and those you interact with. Be a good example of the believers. And we're going to continue this soon, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.